Hi, I hope this video finds you well. My name is Felcia Gellagos. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Outreach and Prevention Coordinator for the Savvy office at Utah State University. Before we get started into today's topic on survivor-sensitive response, I want to give you a little bit of background about who I am. So I started working with the Savvy office, the Sexual Assault and Anti-Violence Information Office with Utah State University in 2016. I started my time there as an advocate working with survivors on campus. Later on, as I continued my education into my MSW program, I also had the opportunity to do clinical hours with survivors. Being able to do advocacy and therapy with survivors of interpersonal violence gave me such a unique perspective into the experiences survivors were having, as well as how important it is that we respond to survivors appropriately. So I became really passionate about outreach and prevention work, which then led me to the position I'm in now. So I spend all of my days talking to people not only about how to prevent sexual violence, interpersonal violence within our community and on our campus, but also how we should respond to survivors. And that's what I want to do today. I want to talk to you about responding to someone who comes forward and discloses an experience to you. It can feel very intimidating and scary and nerve-wracking about what you're going to say. But I want to make it very simple for you and make it responding to survivors something that comes naturally to you. So that's what the goal is today. Up on the screen, you do see contact information for me. So if you have any questions following this presentation, unfortunately, you're not in the room with me today, but I'd be happy to answer them either via phone or email. All right, so let's get started. First of all, I want to make sure that we are on the same page about some really important terminology that I will use throughout this presentation. The first being survivor. You've heard me say this a couple of times already, but I want to make sure you're clear. I choose to use the term survivor when referring to someone who has experienced interpersonal violence. Now, survivors have the ability to label themselves however they see fit, and it's important to keep that in mind. But for the purpose of today's presentation, I will be using survivor. Now, when I talk about survivor, I of course mean those who directly experience interpersonal violence. But I also am referring to an individual who may know somebody and is close to a survivor, a primary survivor, or somebody who has witnessed interpersonal violence. That's what we refer to as secondary survivor. So when I say survivor, it is this blanket term for an individual who they themselves has experienced interpersonal violence, an individual who knows someone who has experienced interpersonal violence, or someone who has witnessed interpersonal violence. So we're on the same page about what survivor means. The next term I've used a lot is interpersonal violence. So I want to make sure we get on the same page with that as well. Now, I've listed on the screen 4 unique categories that we look at when considering interpersonal violence. However, it's important to keep in mind, while I've narrowed it down to 4 categories, the experiences within each category are very broad. There are a number of experiences that can happen within each category. And we have to keep that in mind so we don't narrow ourselves to survivors only being able to experience certain things. But let's go through these 4 categories. First of all, we're looking at sexual harassment. Right? This is often verbal, nonverbal harassment that's sexual in nature towards someone. Then we have sexual assault. Now, this can be broken down into 2 categories, contact and penetration. When we think about sexual assault, initially, we often think of the penetration, right? That's what's shown in movies and media all of the time. But it's important we keep in mind contact. Non-consensual contact can also be considered sexual assault. Then we get into relationship violence, which we break down into 2 categories. We have both dating and domestic violence. And then finally, stalking. Again, when we think of stalking, an image may pop into our head of somebody following someone around, right? And this often does happen. However, we are currently seeing a use of technology, an increase in the use of technology being used to stalk another individual. So while these are the 4 categories I'm referring to when I say interpersonal violence, it's important again to remember that there are a broad range of experiences that can happen within each category. All right, so we're on the same page about survivor and we're on the same page about interpersonal violence. So these are the 2 terms I'm going to be using quite a bit today. The next thing I want to get us on the same page about is trauma. It is more likely than not, when a survivor experiences interpersonal violence, they will become traumatized. They will experience trauma. And it's important that we learn how to recognize what trauma looks like. This is important because when a survivor experiences interpersonal violence, it is very unlikely that they come forward right away after their experience, right? That they come to you right after it happens and discloses that. There's a number of reasons why, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's important that we learn to recognize what trauma can look like, because these are the signs we're going to see in an individual before they come forward and explicitly tell us that they experienced something. Now, just like with interpersonal violence, there are a broad range of reactions someone can have to a traumatic experience. And so it's important to keep in mind that not everybody responds a certain way to trauma, nor should they. But there are some similarities that we often see, and that's what I'm going to highlight for you today. The first of which is in a short term, right after an incident happens, there's going to be a lot of shock and denial. Maybe it seems that they're passive or they're kind of numb, right? That's what we often see right after. And that's because their brain and their body are processing what just happened and how they feel about it. And that takes time. So that's what we're going to see initially following an incident. Then over time, as they continue to live with their experience without disclosing it, these are some of the signs that we may see. Perhaps an individual is falling behind academically, right? They can no longer exert as much energy and effort into their academics as they once could. Maybe they're showing you unpredictable emotions, right? Where one day they're incredibly anxious and scared, and then the next day they're really happy and joyful, and then the next day they're angry. The reason that we see this in survivors is because when someone experiences a traumatic incident, like interpersonal violence, any of those forms we listed earlier, their body enters what we call tonic immobility. In layman's term, it's referred to as the freeze response. We hear about flight or fight all the time in school. The freeze response is what we see when a survivor experiences trauma. And what it looks like is it's basically the brain inside the body freezing over the body's emotional response. Now, it doesn't mean somebody literally freezes and can't move. It's more of an internal function. And the body does that to protect itself from what's happening. However, after the incident happens, that begins to thaw, right? Those emotions begin to thaw out and the survivor begins to re-experience the incident. And so that is going to lead to these unpredictable emotions where one day they're anxious, one day they're sad, one day they're happy, all over the place, right? Because they're slowly thawing out those emotions. The next thing that we see is strained relationships. Survivors are often very ashamed of what happened to them. And because of that, they push away those that they're closest to. They often don't feel worthy to have those relationships anymore. Or maybe they're scared that by being with you and hanging out with their close friends or family, they're going to disclose their experience and then be shamed, right? There's a lot of fear. Now, it's very unlikely that you would respond by shaming them. However, that fear is very real for survivors. And so they start to push those that they're close to away. We often see physical symptoms. Trauma manifests itself physically, and it's unexplainable physical symptoms. So unexplainable stomach aches or headaches, we see this all the time. The next we often see is an inability to concentrate. So we talk about trauma like a ball in the brain that's a box. So your brain is a box. And when trauma first happens, there's a ball in that box that takes up the entire space of that box. So your brain is filled with this trauma, with thinking about it, processing it, the emotions associated with it, and there's very little room to think about anything else. And so it can be really difficult to concentrate at school or at work or in your home life. And so, over time, as the survivor seeks help and is able to process that trauma, that ball shrinks and it becomes easier to concentrate on other things. But before someone has received help, that trauma it fills the brain box. And so we often see an inability to concentrate. Now, sometimes the survivor can also begin to overachieve, right? They throw themselves into their work and into their school and into their social activities. And they do this because they're avoiding moments of silence where maybe they think about their experience. And then finally, survivors can turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? Which can include self-harm or drug or alcohol abuse, because they're just, again, either numbing out or avoiding the situation. Now, I list all of these again because this is what we generally see. And this is what you, as a friend or a family member or a colleague to a survivor, is going to likely see before someone comes forward and discloses to you. So be on the lookout for these signs. But also remember, this isn't necessarily exactly how someone will respond, but any dramatic change in behavior should throw up a red flag for you to check in on that individual and see if they're okay, and allow for that opportunity for them to disclose to you. Now, that being said, let's talk about how you disclose, or how you respond when someone discloses. Before we can even talk about the actual step-by-step, what to say, what to do, we need to take a look within inside of ourselves. We have to start by looking at our own perception of interpersonal violence and of survivors. Now, why? Why would we need to do that? I'm helping somebody else. Why do I need to look within? Well, I will tell you why. It's because when we have a perception of interpersonal violence or survivors, that creates a barrier to us being able to recognize an incident or a survivor. That's not going to allow us to help that survivor effectively. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean. So we refer to these as these perceptions or these stereotypes as implicit biases, right? Implicit biases are unconscious beliefs that we hold. And they can be shaped by a number of things, by what we see in the media, by what we've been told by our family or our friends. But it's basically just these perceptions and these ideals we have towards survivors and interpersonal violence. Some of these biases include, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, include the following: LGBTQA plus survivors. If we have a bias towards same-sex relationships, for example, then we may not be able to recognize when someone is in an abusive relationship, for example. If we don't want to think about a lesbian relationship, for example, our friend who's in a lesbian relationship, if we distance ourselves from that because we're uncomfortable, we may not be able to recognize when our friend in that relationship starts experiencing abuse, right? So that can get in the way, those biases. Male survivors is another huge bias. As a society, we often don't think about men being survivors of interpersonal violence. And so if we have that idea that men can't be abused, we're not going to be able to recognize when a man in our family or our friend group is being abused. Another bias is, again, what healing should look like, right? We talked about this, what trauma should look like. Because of movies and TV shows, survivors are often depicted as very distraught and broken and crying and scared. Now, while this is sometimes the case for a survivor, it isn't always that way. But if we hold a bias that someone who experiences interpersonal violence responds that way, when someone doesn't respond that way, for example, maybe they're overachieving or they're super happy and joyful, we may not be able to believe that they really experience interpersonal violence because they're supposed to look like this, right? The next one, the impact of the incident. Again, that's kind of what I just talked about, but I want to expand a little bit too about the healing process. We often feel that if somebody experienced interpersonal violence, they would immediately go to the police or the hospital or, a local sexual assault or domestic violence agency, that they would immediately seek that help. When someone doesn't, maybe our bias gets in the way and we think, well, they didn't go report that, or they didn't seek help for that. Maybe it didn't really happen, right? And then the final one is this perfect victim mentality. What I mean by that is that media has portrayed this perfect victim scenario. Whereas if someone experiences a sexual assault, it's from a stranger in a dark alley. Or if someone experiences domestic violence, it's often the husband abusing the wife physically. We have this very concrete narrative painted in our mind about what a perfect victim should look like. It's important. And so that bias can get in our way if someone disclosing to us, if their story doesn't fit that exact narrative. Do you see what I'm saying? So these are just a few of the biases we may hold, and that may get in the way of our ability to respond to a survivor. Now, I'm not here to shame you for having these biases or these perceptions of the world. I'm not. We were all shaped by our family and media and the groups we were a part of, and there's a reason we believe and picture things the way that we do. But it's important to remember it's important to remember to recognize these biases within yourself. You have to be able to recognize them, because if you hold a bias that does get in the way of helping a survivor, you cannot let it. For example, if a male in your family comes to you and says that they experienced some form of interpersonal violence, you cannot let your bias that men can't be abused get in the way of you helping that individual. So this is what I mean by we have to start by looking within, right? What biases do we have? What perceptions do we have of interpersonal violence and survivors? What do we think and see that could get in the way of us helping a survivor? So look within yourself. Please contact me if you want to dive deeper into this. And we actually have another video on here that will dive deeper into implicit bias. But it's important to start by recognizing those. Once that we have recognized our implicit bias and we have made sure that that is not going to get in the way of us helping somebody, we can move to response, what you're all here for, or finally to it, responding to a survivor of interpersonal violence. Now, I hear all the time how scared individuals are about responding to someone who discloses to them. I get it. I was terrified when I started in this work. An individual is coming to you telling one of the most intimate stories of their life and the scariest experiences that they've had to you, and you have to know how to respond. It can seem very intimidating. But my goal today is to make sure that you walk away from this knowing that it's actually quite simple. For a survivor, working with survivors for years and talking to survivors, it's always about how you make them feel, more so than what exactly you say when they come forward. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But I want you to start this section by thinking to yourself, if I experienced any of these forms of violence, and I got the insane amount of courage it takes to confide in somebody, how would I want them to respond? That is what will guide how you respond to someone coming forward. But let me give you some step-by-steps. First of all, you have to start by listening. Start by listening to the survivor. Let them share with you what they need to share. It's important to keep in mind that before a survivor even comes forward to you to talk to you, they already are filled with fear and doubt surrounding their experience. They're afraid that they won't be believed, that they will even be blamed for what happened to them. Maybe they're ashamed of their experience. And maybe there was some other things that were happening during their incident. For example, maybe they were drinking underage, that they are terrified to disclose because they don't want to be judged. They don't want to get in trouble. They are terrified. Survivors are terrified to come forward. And it's important that we keep that in mind and that we let that guide our response to them. That we listen and we comfort them and we let them know that they shouldn't be afraid to come to us. One of the most concrete ways that we can do that is avoid asking why questions when someone comes forward. When a survivor experiences interpersonal violence, they immediately begin to question everything that they did or said to leading up and during that experience. They're asking themselves, why did I go there? Why did I wear that? Why didn't I tell somebody I was doing that? Why didn't I seek help sooner? Why didn't I report this? The list goes on and on and on. They are already beginning to blame themselves for what happened, and they are questioning through and through their experience and what they could have done differently so that it didn't happen. Because it's really difficult to believe that something so horrific can happen to you and you had no control over it. That it was the sole responsibility of the individual who perpetrated the crime. When a survivor discloses their experience and the person they're disclosing to asks those same questions, why did you go there alone? Why did you wear that? Why didn't you report that? The list goes on and on. That solidifies these doubts in the survivor's head. And, I have heard these why questions asked from so well-intentioned individuals, right? It's normal for us to ask these questions. It's how we can protect ourselves, right? Because we, as the person who's listening to this survivor disclose, we're trying to figure out exactly what happened, where it went wrong, so that we can guarantee we never put ourselves in that situation. Because again, it is so difficult to process, near impossible for us to process that this crime, that this form of violence that happened was completely the responsibility of somebody else. But that is the reality. And it doesn't benefit a survivor for us to be questioning and in those questions somewhat blaming the survivor for what happened. Research shows that if a survivor comes forward about their response, they disclose to someone, and they are not believed, they're likely to never tell another individual again. This means not reporting to law enforcement. This means not seeking therapeutic or therapy or advocacy. It's so important how we respond to a survivor, that we avoid asking questions that doubt their experience or put the blame on them. We simply listen, right? Express empathy. It's okay to say, I am so sorry that you're here. I am so sorry that this happened to you. But I'm here to help, right? Recognize again that healing is not black and white. We cannot force a survivor to do one thing or another. It's important for us to offer them all of their options and to support them with what they choose. Allow the survivor to heal in their own way. Trust the survivor to know what's best for them. It is all about listening and affirming and supporting that survivor, helping remove that fear and that doubt as they come forward and disclose to you. Again, remember, if you came forward and disclosed something to somebody so personal, so scary, how would you want them to respond to you? Now, it is important that I do pause and say that if within your role, whether that be professionally at your work or in another role that you hold in maybe leadership groups, it is so important that if you have a reporting responsibility, that you interrupt and inform that survivor of your reporting responsibility before they disclose their entire story to you. It may seem very awkward to interrupt a survivor as they begin disclosing, but I will tell you it is imperative that you do so, because it is much more harmful for a survivor to disclose their entire story and then be told that that's going to be reported. So please interrupt and inform the survivor, no matter how awkward it may be. If you feel that something is going to be disclosed to you that you will have to report, let them know. And the final step to responding is to refer and report. Offer confidential resources to the survivor. If they do not choose to report to law enforcement at this moment, refer them to confidential advocates that can help them navigate the process. And then also ensure their safety if applicable, right? Contacting law enforcement or the hospital if that's what's needed. But again, become familiar with resources so that when a survivor does come to you, you can offer them all of their options. I've listed a few here for those located in our Cache Valley community. These are some confidential resources. This is a teeny tiny list of all the resources available to survivors in our valley, but I just wanted to point out a few. Of course, we have my office on campus, Savvy Office, and then we have our sister agency, CAPSA, in the community, which I know you're all familiar with, but they provide safe, caring, confidential advocates and therapists that can guide a survivor through this reporting process, or at least through their processing their trauma. It's also important that you know that the Cache Valley Hospital in North Logan is the only location in the valley that does Code R exams. So if someone does choose to get a sexual assault forensic exam done following a sexual assault, that's where you want to guide them to. We also have the Family Place, who offers numerous resources to families and individuals. Again, this list is nowhere near comprehensive, and I encourage you to do some digging on your own and find out what confidential resources are available in your area. These are some USU specific. I mentioned my office, and then we also have CAPS, the Counseling and Psychological Services, and our Logan campus Student Health and Wellness Center. So it's important, if you're working with a USU student, that they know that these are the only confidential offices on campus. So oftentimes students ask about disclosing to faculty who are responsible employees and do have to report what they hear to Title IX. So if a survivor is looking for a confidential resource within the university system, here's a couple for you. Now, before we move on to some frequently asked questions that I get, since you're not all here, I put some together. But I want to back up and tell you a little bit of a story that helped me when I started in this work and I was worried about responding to survivors. So this happened, probably like 7 years ago. Our office, the Savvy Office, was doing an event on campus where we were hosting a panel of survivors of domestic violence to raise awareness about domestic violence. And so before we do these events, we always sit down with each panelist and let them know what the event is going to be about and answer their questions so that they feel comfortable going into this panel. My supervisor at the time was sitting down with one of the panelists talking about what the experience was going to be like. While they were talking, the intern, who happened to be a male-identified individual, walked into the room to ask my supervisor a question. As he entered the room, the survivor whom my supervisor was talking to burst into tears. She began crying. And of course, my supervisor, feeling horrible, was like shooing out the male intern, thinking that his presence walking into the office had triggered her because she had been abused by a male. And so my supervisor was apologizing, and the survivor said, no, that's not what's happening. And she began to tell my supervisor this story. She said, "The night that I decided to leave my husband, the domestic violence situation she was in. I had called the police, and from that phone call, a whirlwind of events began happening. I was telling my story to law enforcement officers. I was working with social workers. I was being pulled from my house and brought to CAPSA. It was a lot of chaos. And I just felt like a piece. I was numb. I was just a piece moving through the game. She said, when I showed up at CAPSA and I checked in to stay at the shelter, he was there, that intern. He was there to check me in. And he was the first person that night to look at me and say, I am so sorry that this happened to you, but we're here to help. She said that was all he said, but it shifted my entire experience because I knew I was heard and I was cared for and I wasn't alone. After that survivor left my supervisor's office, she debriefed with the intern. And he said, I remember that night. It was my first night working in the shelter. And to be honest, I didn't know what else to say. That's truly how simple it is when responding to a survivor. It is about making sure that they know that they are heard, that they are cared for, and that you are going to make sure that they are connected to the resources needed to heal from their experience. Again, think about how would you want somebody to respond? That is how you respond to a survivor. Now, I have a couple of frequently asked questions. Since nobody's here to ask questions, I wanted to just put them in here. This is what I often get when I do this presentation. The first of is, how can I make it apparent from the start that I am approaching the conversation with the survivor in a survivor-sensitive manner? Again, start the conversation with empathy. I'm so sorry you're here. I cannot imagine what you're going through, but I'm here to help, and I'm glad you came. Let them know that you are here to listen. Don't force them to tell you things that they're not ready to tell you. Let them tell you as much or as little information as they feel comfortable. Let them guide the conversation. Again, it's all about empathy and explicitly expressing that. The next question I often get is, how might a survivor respond or behave when I've said or done something that isn't survivor sensitive? So maybe you asked one of those why questions, or maybe one of your biases got in the way, right? Like a male friend comes to you and you say, you can't be abused, you're a man. You're human. That's likely to happen. But how do you recognize that you've said something that may have triggered the survivor? These are some things that we often see. Maybe they become more quiet, right? They silence, they stop really telling you their story. They're frazzled, they start fumbling their words, they avoid looking at you directly, a nervous laugh sometimes. We often, as humans, resort to humor when we're uncomfortable. Ultimately, trust your gut. If it feels like something in the conversation went south, trust that maybe something did. And then how do you recover from that, right? You said something you didn't mean to say. How do you recover? Acknowledge it. Outwardly acknowledge it. It goes like this, I just made that comment. That was an initial gut reaction, and I didn't mean that how it sounded. I'm sorry that I said that because you're a man, you can't be abused. I can't imagine how that made you feel. It probably made you question disclosing to me any further. But please, I didn't mean that. Please continue. I'm here to listen. Again, we're human. We're going to make mistakes when responding to a survivor, but always go back to how you would want somebody to respond to you. Make sure that you are listening with empathy and affirming that coming to you was a good decision for that survivor. And then make sure, above all else, that they are connected to professional resources that can continue to support them and guide them through their healing discovery. I am so thankful that I was able to have this conversation with you today. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments or would like to see this presentation come to your group, whether that be at work or in your extracurriculars. Thank you.